Tonight's Torah portion is the Torah portion of Balak. And before we get into the unique topic that we'll be focusing on, we'll give a quick overview of the Torah portion and what it speaks about. So this week's Torah portion speaks about Balak, who is the king of Moab, summons the prophet Bilam to curse the people of Israel. On the way, Bilam is berated by his donkey, who sees, before Bilam does, the angel that Hashem sends to block their way. 3 times, from 3 different vantage points, Bilam attempts to pronounce his curses. Each time, blessings issue forth instead. Bilam also prophesies on the end of days and of the coming of Moshiach. The Torah portion concludes that the people fall prey to the charms of the daughters of Moab and are enticed to worship the idol Peor. When a high-ranking Israelite official publicly takes a Midianite princess into a tent, Pinchas kills them both, stopping the plague raging amongst the people. The famous story in the beginning of the Torah portion of the talking donkey, where the donkey berates Bilam, because he tells Bilam did not see the angel, but the donkey did, so the donkey stopped. And Bilam starts hitting the donkey. And he hits him once, he hits him twice, he hits him a 3rd time, and miraculously God allowed the donkey to speak, and he starts talking to Bilam, and he says, "Why are you hitting me? I am your trusty donkey. Look, you didn't take your horse on your trip today, you took me, because the horse always throws you off, but me, on the other hand, I've never done something wrong to you. So why are you hitting me now?" And Bilam had nothing to answer. And that's when God allowed Bilam to see the angel, and the rest of the story continues. And so Bilam comes to curse the Jewish people. Not only he doesn't curse, but he blesses them, and then he issues forth prophecies. So tonight we will focus on the prophecies, or one of the prophecies, and that Bilam mentions in this week's Torah portion. Those of you who joined this most recent course from the Jewish Learning Institute, the JLI of This Can Happen, will be somewhat familiar with many of the topics discussed tonight, although it has a very unique spin to it. The idea of Bilam's prophecy was primarily about the coming of Moshiach. And when we think about Moshiach, we think, what is Moshiach? Who is Moshiach? Why are we waiting for Moshiach? Moshiach will be a time of utopia, perfect world. There won't be any fighting, there won't be war, there'll be peace, there won't be any health issues, everyone will be healthy, and so on and so forth. It's the ultimate utopia. And is that really what it's all about? Is it just about the materialistic blessings, or is there something more spiritual? Is there something more profound? Is there something deeper? So yes, in the Messianic age, we can maybe think about it as this great vacation to the Bahamas where we can live without any issues whatsoever. But really, there's a deeper and greater global vision for humanity that Moshiach will usher in. And so the question is, what is Moshiach and who are we waiting for? What is this Moshiach that we're waiting for? And so we'll begin with this week's Torah portion, one of the prophecies of Bilam, the Gentile prophet. Text 1, if you have the textbooks, it's on page 193. Parenthetically, tonight is the final class for season 3 of this year. Season 4 begins next week, so if you need a new book, it'll be in next week's email to order a new textbook beginning for next week's class. So text 1 from this week's Torah portion. These are the words of Bilam. I see it, but not now. I behold it, but not soon. A star has gone forth from Jacob, and a staff will arise from Israel, that will crush the princes of Moab and uproot all the sons of Seth. Edom shall be possessed, and Seir shall become the possession of his enemies, and Israel shall triumph. A ruler shall come out of Jacob and destroy the remnants of the city. What's he referring to? And so we'll look at Maimonides. Maimonides' final 2 chapters of his entire majestic halachic encyclopedia known as the Mishnah Torah, what he's most famous for. So in the final 2 chapters of the entire book, He has 2 chapters about the laws of kings and wars and the laws of King Moshiach. And so in chapter 11, just before, the penultimate chapter, just before chapter 12, the final chapter, he writes as follows, talking about the idea of Mashiach, and in this section of his chapter, he's explaining how we know that Mashiach is going to come to redeem the Jewish people. What are the proofs in the verse? In the verse from the 5 books of Moses. And so he quotes a number of verses that speak about Mashiach, but here he quotes it quite clearly out these verses, and he explains in great detail what these verses are referencing. The words of Maimonides' text 2. It is even written in the Torah portion of Bilam, who prophesied about both the Mashiachs. The first Mashiach was David, King David, who saved Israel from her adversities. The final Mashiach will be from his sons and will deliver Israel from the hands of the descendants of Esau. There it says in our Torah portion, Maimonides is quoting, I see it, but not now. This refers to David. Bilam was prophesying that he sees something in the future, someone, and that someone is a reference to King David. In that same verse, it has a second half. I behold it, but not soon. This is the King Moshiach, says Maimonides. A star has gone forth from Jacob. This is a reference to King David, and a staff will arise from Israel. This is the King Moshiach. They will crush the princes of Moab. This is David, and so it says, and he smote Moab and measured them with a robe. The second half of that verse is, and uproot all the sons of Seth. This is the King Moshiach, of whom it says, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea. And Edom shall be possessed, continuing quoting the verses from this week's Torah portion. This is David, as it says, and Edom shall become slaves to David. And Seir shall become the possession of his enemies. This is the King Moshiach, as it says, and the Savior shall come upon Mount Zion to judge the Mount of Esau. So what do we have here? We have here Maimonides explaining that this prophecy in this week's Torah portion is a reference to King David. Bilam lived roughly 1,000 years before King David. About 500 years before King David. And it's a prophecy about King David and a prophecy about Mashiach, who will be a descendant of King David. And really, they're in alternating fashion. They're interspersed between each other. These prophecies, half a verse about King David, half a verse about King Moshiach. But there's an obvious question here. So far, it sounds great. But the question is as follows. Why is it important to talk about King David? Why is Maimonides quoting or mentioning King David at all? Here's a book of laws, which are pertinent, which are practical laws. That's Maimonides' book, as we'll soon see. And it's talking about something that's either the present or the future. It's not a history book. So yes, it's nice. It's a homiletical explanation for these verses, but he could have just quoted the verses that are practical for his topic, which was the topic of King Moshiach. And perhaps more importantly, why does he refer to King David as the second Moshiach? Isn't there only one Moshiach? King Moshiach who will redeem the Jewish people? And so the fact that Maimonides quotes it and he says there are 2 Mashiachs gives us a little insight that he's trying to tell us something more than just a verse that talks about Mashiach. The fact that he's quoting both halves of each verse and mentioning King David, King Moshiach, it's because there's something there that actually teaches us something practical for the coming of the ultimate Mashiach by knowing about King David. And so, before we get to that, just want to put in parenthetically that this quote from Maimonides is actually quoting from the Midrash. This idea that these verses are talking about Moshiach, it's quite obvious that it's talking about Moshiach, but which aspect is talking about which Moshiach? The fact that the first half of the verse is referring to King David, the second half of the verse is talking about Moshiach, that's Maimonides' perception of this passage. There are other perceptions of this passage, and we'll have a sampling of them here, that there's other ways of reading this prophecy from our Torah portion. Here's another midrash which explains as follows. Israel said before the Holy One, blessed be he, Master of the world, how long must we be subjugated? So God said to them, until the day comes about which it is said, a star has gone forth from Jacob, and a staff will arise from Israel. When a star comes from Jacob and burns the straw of Esau. That first verse, that verse that the Midrash here is quoting, is from our Torah portion. And it's not making a distinction between King David or King Moshiach. From where do we know this will happen, continues the Midrash, as it says, and the house of Jacob will be as a fire, and the house of Joseph as a flame. The house of Esau shall become straw, and they shall ignite them and consume them. Said the Holy One, blessed be he, at the time I will manifest my kingship and reign over you, as it says, and the saviors shall come upon Mount Zion to judge the mount of Esau, and God shall have the kingdom. So here, the Midrash is telling us that the entirety of the verses of our Torah portion has nothing to do with King David. It all has to do with Moshiach. So Maimonides was of the opinion that our Torah portion is half King David, half Moshiach. The Midrash felt that the entirety of these section of verses, this prophecy, was a reference to Moshiach. Here we have Rashi, who explains it slightly different, but along the same lines. Rashi, our favorite commentary, explains on this week's Torah portion, I see it. Bilam said, I see it, but it is in the future. I see that prominence and greatness of Jacob, but it is not at present, only at a later time. A star has gone forth, as the Targum Onkelos renders it. This is an expression similar to, he has bent Dorach, his bow, for a star shoots out like an arrow. In Old French, Rashi was a French scholar, so he brings in Old French words, distant, as if to say, his good fortune shall rise, prosper. That will crush the princes of Moab. This refers to David, of whom it says, he laid them on the ground and measured 2 cord lengths to put to death. Quote from the stories of David. Either way, what we have here is, with this final quote, and a staff will rise, a king who rules dominantly. And so far, what Rashi is explaining here, all his verses and all his explanations are all saying that these verses are all a reference to King David, nothing to do with Moshiach. But he doesn't stop there. These are the 2 verses that Maimonides quoted and said that half are about Moshiach, half about King David. And the Midrash that we quoted earlier said that they're all about Moshiach. Rashi here is explaining that these 2 verses are all about King David. But Rashi continues and says that Bilam's prophecy didn't end here. There's another verse. Another couple verses. The following verses, the subsequent verses, are actually about Moshiach, says Rashi. A ruler shall come out of Jacob. There will be another ruler from Jacob aside from King David, and destroy the remnant of the city, of the most prominent city of Edom, that is Rome. He says this regarding the King Moshiach, of whom it says, and his dominion shall be from sea to sea, and the house of Esau shall have no survivors. And so Rashi and the Midrash seem to say that it's referring to one individual exclusively. Rashi says the first 2 verses are referring to King David, and the subsequent verses are referring to Moshiach. The Midrash says it's all about Moshiach, but Maimonides is of the opinion that it's interspersed. Every verse half about Moshiach, half about King David. This is just a sampling to see the idea that these verses are not so clear-cut which aspect is referring to what, but the consensus and everyone's in agreement that they're all referring to King David and Moshiach on some level. Either half the verses, 1 verse, some verses, all the verses, they're definitely referring to Moshiach. And so we'll get back to Maimonides' view, which is half the verses are referring to Moshiach and half the verses are referring to King David. And we'll just recap our question, which is, why does Maimonides have to quote the verses referencing King David? Why is David necessary for the laws of King Moshiach when we're talking about the future? There's an interesting perspective that will shed some light on this question and give us to understand why Maimonides is quoting King David. And we'll begin with a story, an interesting story, a little comical from the Talmud, text 5. And based on that, we'll understand one perspective on why Maimonides brings the historical precedent of King David, even though seemingly it isn't a practical application to this idea. Here's the story. A certain heretic said to Gevia ben Psisa, that was his name. So the heretic said to Gevia ben Psisa, "Woe unto you, the wicked, as you say, the dead will come to life. The way of the world is that those who are alive die. How can you say that the dead will come to life?" So the heretic was making fun of Judaism and telling it to Gevia ben Psisa, who was a respected Jew at the time. And he told him, "Do you believe in resurrection of the dead? What a laughing stock. People who are alive die. Dead people don't come back alive." Gevia ben Psisa answered him, "Woe unto you, the wicked, as you say the dead will not come to life. If those who are not in existence come to life, is it not reasonable all the more so that those who were once alive will come to life again?" So the heretic said to Gevia ben Psisa angrily, "You're calling me wicked? If I get up, I will kick you and flatten your hump," as Gevia ben Psisa was a hunchback. So Gevia ben Psisa said to him, "If you do so, you will be called an expert doctor, and I will be able to take high wages, and you'll be able to take high wages for your services." He was a hunchback. He said, "Look, I've been to many doctors. No one was able to heal me. If you'll be able to fix my hunchback, that'll be wonderful." But let's skip this. Let's not focus on the comedic aspect, that final exchange. Let's look at the first aspect of the exchange. What's the first aspect of the exchange? The Talmud is establishing proof for the future resurrection and is trying to bring some sort of logical proof. And that seems like an impossibility because we know that the nature of the world is those who are alive do pass on, and those who pass on don't come back alive. It just doesn't happen. It's not the rules of nature. But the Talmud is explaining very simply. It says this miracle of resurrection of the dead has already happened to a much greater degree. Resurrection of the dead isn't so bizarre. Birth, a newborn, is a lot more bizarre. Something from nothing, something that's nothing, and suddenly it's a person, it's a little person, it comes alive, and then it grows older to a thinking person. That's way more miraculous than resurrection of the dead. Right, I'll give you an example. If you have a car, and the car, its transmission blew, or the engine's shot, and you got to put in a new engine. You have a choice. Either you can go and build yourself a car from scratch, or bring your old car to the mechanic or to the original company and they'll put in a new motor. It'll cost you a few $1,000s. It'll be an expensive repair. But what's your choice? Build a new car from scratch or take an old car that's not working anymore and fix it? Of course, it's easier to fix an old car than to build a new car from scratch. And it's more logical. This car once worked. We're not talking about a car that's missing most of its hardware and this doesn't, it can't go even if you fixed it. We're talking about a car that the engine's shot. So a human being whose soul departed, what's the big deal for God to reinsert that soul into the body that was already there? But when it comes to a newborn, that's a newborn, something from nothing. Says the Talmud, that's the most logical proof you can possibly have for resurrection of the dead. It's no biggie. It's not a big deal. It's not bizarre. Birth is a lot more miraculous. Birth is a lot more bizarre. Say the story that the scientist comes to God and says, God, I think I can create man just like you did. God says, really? He says, yeah, give me a chance. Give me a chance to make a better human being than you did. So God says, all right, I'll give you a chance. So the scientist goes, and he's very excited. He bends over and he starts picking up a handful of dust. God says, you got to get your own dust. You got to begin from scratch. So Gvia ben Psisa, the Talmud is telling us that belief in something that happened already isn't as miraculous as something that's never happened. That's what he's teaching us about the resurrection of the dead. So too with Moshiach. What Maimonides is telling us here is that belief in Moshiach may seem like something really abstract. A leader who will rule over all the Jewish people, build the temple. These things seem impossible. Says Maimonides, they're not impossible. It's not bizarre. It's not so unique. It's happened already with King David. He ruled over the entire Jewish population. They lived peacefully in Israel. The enemies disappeared. He started building the temple. So it happened already. It's believable that Moshiach will come. In other words, Maimonides is quoting this historical precedent to give us an extra boost in the belief of Moshiach. To take things a step further, there's a great 16th century sage who has a commentary on Maimonides. His name is Rabbi Moshe D. Trani, and he explains similar concept, but he takes it a step further. He explains as follows, first quoting Maimonides and then giving his explanation. Even Bilam prophesies of two Moshiachs, about the first Moshiach who was David and about the last Moshiach who will emerge from his progeny. And here's where he explains. Just as his prophecy was fulfilled with the first Moshiach, so will it be fulfilled with the last. He says, Maimonides is telling us an extra step of belief, an extra boost for our belief. This idea that if in the same verse there are two prophecies, and one has been fulfilled, that gives us an extra boost to our belief that the second half of the same verse will also be fulfilled. Again, it's by Maimonides inserting this historical precedent about King David, it's giving us this boost in our belief of Moshiach. Similar concept is this inspiring and powerful story from the Talmud concerning Rabbi Akiva following the destruction of the temple. Rabbi Akiva lived shortly after the destruction of the temple, and the Talmud relates a story. Text 7. Yet again, they were climbing the hills towards Jerusalem together. The Talmud tells one story, and I was telling another story about Rabbi Akiva and three other sages who were on a walk together, going on a hike. They were climbing the hills towards Jerusalem together, and once they had crested Mount Scopus, they tore their clothing as a halachic sign of mourning, which parenthetically is still the law till today. According to Jewish law, someone who reaches Temple Mount is supposed to tear their clothing in a sign of mourning. Once they had reached the Temple Mount, they saw a fox emerging from the place where the Holy of Holies had once stood. The other sages, they started to weep, but Rabbi Akiva laughed. Why are you laughing? They demanded. He answered like a traditional Jew. Why are you weeping? He answered with a question, he replied. They lamented, a place of which it is said, and the common man that draws near shall be put to death. Such a holy place has now become the haunt of foxes. Should we not weep? So he replied, Rabbi Akiva tells them, this is precisely why I am laughing. For it is written in Isaiah, and I will take to me faithful witnesses to record Uriah the priest and Zechariah the son of Yevrachia. Now, what is a connection between Uriah the priest and Zechariah? Asks rhetorically Rabbi Akiva. Uriah lived during the times of the first temple, whereas Zechariah lived during the second temple. So why is Isaiah the prophet joining them together? Nevertheless, continued Rabbi Akiva, the holy writings have linked the later prophecy of Zechariah with the earlier prophecy of Uriah. In the earlier prophecy of Uriah it is written, therefore because of you, Zion shall be plowed as a field, a prophecy of the destruction. In Zechariah it is written, there shall yet be a time when old men and old women will sit in the promenades of Jerusalem, which is a prophecy of the coming of Moshiach and the rebuilding of the temple, as those verses continue in Zechariah. And so Rabbi Akiva finally gets to the explanation of why he's laughing. So long as Uriah's prophecy had not been fulfilled, in other words, of the extent of the destruction of the temple as prophesied by Uriah, that it will be plowed as a field. So long as it had not been fulfilled, I had misgivings lest Zechariah's prophecy might also not be fulfilled literally. Now that Uriah's prophecy has been literally fulfilled, it is certain that Zechariah's prophecy will also find its literal fulfillment. Rabbi Akiva was telling them the fact that Isaiah joined these two prophets, even though they lived hundreds of years apart, is because Isaiah was giving a prophecy in and of himself. He was joining them in one verse. And Isaiah was telling us, the way Rabbi Akiva understood it was that so long as the first one, the complete destruction, the plowing of a field with a fox coming out, that prophecy hadn't been fulfilled, there's no guarantee that the second half of the prophecy will be fulfilled, that the temple will be rebuilt. But now that I see a fox coming out, I see how far the destruction went. It's exactly as related in the prophecy. The temple has been destroyed to that extent. The prophecy has been fulfilled. Now I know that the second half of the verse, the second prophecy, the prophecy of Zechariah, will also definitely be fulfilled with the rebuilding of the temple. And so Maimonides is telling us the same idea. When we see in this verse, the verses from our Torah portion, from Balaam's prophecy, the idea that King David has been fulfilled, because again, it was a prophecy of Balaam. Once King David was fulfilled, now we know that the second half of King Moshiach will also be fulfilled. And so Maimonides is placing it in his book of laws because he wants to teach us, give us this extra boost of the historical precedent. So we've kind of resolved this idea on why the need to intersperse prophecies about Moshiach with the prophecies about King David. But there's another question. Granted, Maimonides, you want to put in something about a precedent to inspire the faith, to show how it's more practical, to show how it's happened already, to show how the first half was already fulfilled, so the second half was already fulfilled. Why King David? King David wasn't the first redeemer of the Jewish people. Yes, he was a king. He led the Jews into battle, but he didn't redeem them from exile, as Moshiach will redeem us. The first redeemer of the Jewish people who redeemed them from exile was Moses, Moshe Rabbeinu. Not only that, the Midrash actually juxtaposes Moshe with King Moshiach, and it calls Moshe the first redeemer, and it refers to Moshiach as the latter, the final redeemer. So why didn't Maimonides quote that passage? And that would have served the purpose, and it would seemingly would have been more accurate for his purpose of showing us that we've been redeemed from exile already. Here's the Midrash, text 8. Rabbi Brachia said in the name of Rabbi Yitzchak, the last redeemer will be just as the first. Just as it says of the first redeemer, so Moshe took his wife and his sons, mounted them upon the donkey, and he went off to redeem the Jewish people from Egypt. So too will the last Redeemer be, as it says, humble and riding on a donkey. The verse refers to King Moshiach, and it says he will be humble and riding on a donkey, just as Moses came with a donkey. Just as the first Redeemer, Moses, brought down the manna, as it says, behold, I am going to rain down for you bread from heaven. So too the last Redeemer will bring down manna, as it says, may there be an abundance of grain in the land. Reference to Moshiach. Just as the first Redeemer, Moshe, brought up the well, so too the last Redeemer, Moshiach, will bring up the water, as it says, and a spring will issue from the house of God, and I will water the valley of Shittim. And so the Midrash actually calls Moshe the first Redeemer. Why not mention Moshe? Why King David? And perhaps even greater, but stronger to focus on the point that I mentioned in the beginning, is this idea of Maimonides and the reason why he wrote his book. Here's a quote from Maimonides' introduction on why he wrote his halachic encyclopedia Mishnah Torah. Text 9. Therefore I girded my loins, I, Moses, the son of Maimon, of Spain. I relied upon the rock, blessed be he. I contemplated all these texts and sought to compose a work that would include the conclusions derived from all these texts regarding the forbidden and the permitted, the impure and the pure, and the remainder of the Torah's laws, all in clear and concise terms, so that the entire oral law could be organized in each person's mouth without questions or objections. Maimonides states very clearly in his introduction, his purpose is to lay out in a very concise and precise form all the laws of the Torah. Not midrashim, not the reasons for the laws, not the understanding, the backstory of the laws, just the actual cold, hard facts, the laws themselves. Which begs the question, this quote from Maimonides that we've been talking all along about, his quote from the Midrash of the two Moshiachs, the first Moshiach, the second Moshiach, what type of law is that? Where does such a Midrash, such a passage, land in a law of cold, hard facts of laws? It's a beautiful Midrash. There's lots of implications, as do many other Midrashim, as do many other passages. But they don't serve the purpose of Maimonides' book of laws, which is cold, hard factual laws without the reasons, without any background. Why does Maimonides place this in a book of laws? How is this, in other words, how is this law, this passage from Maimonides, how is it a law? What does it teach us? And the other question that we asked was, why compare Moshiach to King David? Why don't we compare him to Moses? And so to answer these questions, we have to understand who Moshiach is and what the purpose of Moshiach is. In his final two chapters, Maimonides explains Moshiach. Later on in this chapter, chapter 11, Maimonides describes the coming of Moshiach. Text 10. Do not presume, says Maimonides, that the Messianic king, King Moshiach, must work miracles and wonders, bring about new phenomena in the world, resurrect the dead, or perform other similar deeds. This is definitely not true. Proof can be brought from the fact that Rabbi Akiva, one of the greater sages of the Mishnah, was one of the supporters of King Bar Koziba, or otherwise known as Bar Kokhba, and would describe him as King Moshiach. He and all the sages of his generation considered him, Bar Kokhba, to be King Moshiach until he was killed because of sins. Once he was killed, they realized that he was not Moshiach. And here's the key. Maimonides says the sages did not ask him for any signs or wonders. The main thrust of the matter is, says Maimonides, this Torah, its statutes, and its laws are everlasting. We may not add to them or detract from them. This final point is a point that can get lost, but it's perhaps the most important point regarding the transformation that will take place with the coming of Moshiach. Yes, miracles are wonderful. Yes, when Moshiach comes, he will usher in a utopia which will be miraculous. There'll be world peace, no more battles, no more poverty, no more sickness, no more sadness, and various other prophecies which we may be familiar from the verses of the prophets. But that's all incidental almost, says Maimonides. Moshiach doesn't have to perform miracles to be Moshiach. The miracles aren't necessary for this individual to claim to be Moshiach. What is Moshiach, says Maimonides? What is his purpose? Just like we see Bar Kokhba, Rabbi Akiva, who believed him to be Moshiach, never asked him to show any miracle to prove that you're Moshiach. Let me see a miracle. Let me see you resurrect the dead. Doesn't ask him that. Why not? What is Moshiach? What personifies, what expresses Moshiach, the very being of who Moshiach is? So Maimonides continues and he explains. He says, here's a description of how we know who Moshiach is, says Maimonides. If a king will arise from the house of David, point one, says Maimonides, he has to be from the house of David, who diligently contemplates the laws and observes the Torah and observes its mitzvot as prescribed by the written law and the oral law, as David, his ancestor, did. Point two, he has to be someone who studies Torah and observe all its commandments exactly the way it's prescribed in the written law and the oral law. Nothing to do with miracles. Point three, and will compel all of Israel to walk in the way of Torah. And who will rectify the breaches in its observance. Says Maimonides, what's the fourth point? Fourth box he has to tick, and will fight the wars of God. And this discussion of Maimonides means, based on the verses, if it's a ideological wars or literal wars, but either way, we may, says Maimonides, with assurance, consider him the Mashiach. This individual can be considered Mashiach. We don't know definitely, but he can be considered Mashiach. It's a good candidate. Then he continues. If he succeeds in the above, he does all four of those things. He checks all four of those boxes. He's from the house of David. He observes and studies all the Torah, the written law, the oral law, just like King David, his ancestor. He compels all of Israel to walk in the way of Torah and works to rectify the breaches, and he fights the wars of God. If he does and succeeds all the above, and then two more points. He builds the temple in its place on Temple Mount and gathers the dispersed of Israel to Israel. He is definitely the Mashiach. This individual is definitely Mashiach. And then Maimonides concludes. He will then improve the entire world, motivating all the nations to serve Hashem together. As the verse states, I will transform the peoples to a pure language, and they all will call upon the name of Hashem and serve him with one purpose. Says Maimonides, who is Mashiach? What is the halachic, what is the legal definition of the individual of Mashiach? A person who restores the Davidic dynasty, who enables the complete fulfillment of Torah and mitzvahs, of the commandments. That means that he is someone who observes and whose entire life is devoted to Torah observance, and who fulfills all the commandments, and who ultimately facilitates the complete fulfillment of Torah and its commandments. Because that's the very requirements to know who is Mashiach. That he works on completing his breaches. And not only that, what's the complete breaches? by building the temple and gathering the dispersed into Israel, because only then is when we can actually fulfill all of the commandments. There are certain commandments that are associated, many commandments are associated with the temple, many commandments that are associated with being in Israel. And so Moshiach, what's his goal? What's his mission? Who is he? By definition, what is Moshiach tells us, Maimonides? He is someone who will facilitate the ultimate, complete fulfillment of all the Torah and all the commandments. Everything else are incidental. All other miracles that he will perform, all the miraculous transformation that will occur, those are all incidental. The ultimate transformation of what Moshiach is ushering in is the possibility, the facilitation of fulfilling all the commandments. In the words of the Rebbe, text 12, this is not merely an account of the things that the Moshiach will do and what will happen in his time. Rather, it is a law. The definition of the Moshiach is that he will renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. Not that he will make something new, which in practical terms is actualized through the building of the temple and gathering the dispersed of Israel. Because only then can we fulfill all the commandments. And with this, the purpose and the reason for the coming of the Mashiach is achieved. Then, in his days, the observance of all the statutes will return to their previous state. We will offer sacrifices, observe the sabbatical, in the words of Maimonides, and Jubilee years, according to all their particulars as described by the Torah, which is connected with gathering the dispersed of Israel, once all of Israel is dwelling in its land. And so Maimonides is explaining that the idea of Mashiach, his very legal definition is the fulfillment of the entirety of the Torah. Where does Maimonides get that from? From our Torah portion, from our passage that he quotes in the beginning. The words of the Rebbe. Maimonides' words are, it is even written in the portion of Bilam, who prophesies about both the Mashiachs. The first Mashiach was David, who saved Israel from adversities. The final Mashiach will be from his sons and will deliver Israel in the end of days. From here, we know that the consequence of the Mashiach and the point of the Mashiach is to renew the Davidic dynasty and to restore it to its initial sovereignty. In this sense, he is the final Mashiach, vis-a-vis the first Mashiach, who was David. As the Rambam writes, as Maimonides writes, in that passage from Bilam, it is said that all the details that pertain to the first Mashiach, who was David, will also pertain to the final Mashiach, King Moshiach. From his initial appearance and assumption of sovereignty until he ultimately smote through the corners of Moab, which is paralleled by the Mashiach, and break down all the sons of Seth. Likewise, Edom will be demolished. This refers to David, and Seir will be destroyed. This refers to King Moshiach. The fact that the Torah is juxtaposing King Moshiach and King David is not just about reinforcing our faith in the prophecies. It's providing us with critical information that it's from here that we know the very definition of Mashiach by analyzing who King David was and what he accomplished. Different than Moses. Remember Moses, yes, he was the leader of the Jewish people, but he was never anointed. And he didn't lead the Jews into Israel. And so there were laws that they could not perform. King David was the first king who was anointed and was able to begin building the temple, facilitating the fulfillment of the entirety of the commandments. Says Maimonides, quoting the verse, this is the legal definition of Mashiach, that he is like the first Mashiach, King David. The first king who was anointed, that's what the word Mashiach means. It means the anointed one. The first king that was anointed was King David, and he also was the first one to begin the facilitation of the complete fulfillment of all the commandments, different than Moses. So yes, Moses redeemed the Jewish people. That's not what Moshiach is about. The definition of Moshiach is most closely associated with King David, namely the ultimate complete fulfillment of all the commandments. The Moshiach will bring about the complete fulfillment of the Torah by being liberated from domination by foreign powers. On the contrary, the Moshiach will reign over them. We will be able to properly occupy ourselves with Torah and mitzvahs and be free to be involved in Torah and wisdom without any pressures or disturbances, as Maimonides writes elsewhere. So when Maimonides is introducing this idea of Mashiach in the beginning of chapter 11, when he's teaching us about Mashiach, he's about to tell us about Mashiach. He's not introducing it merely for a proof of, to give us extra boost for our belief in these prophecies. He's giving us the legal definition of what Mashiach is. The legal definition, what we're looking towards, what we're hoping for, what we're praying for. We have to know what we're praying for. We have to know what we're looking towards, looking forward to. What are we looking forward to, says Maimonides? Mashiach, but who is Mashiach? What is his legal definition? Like King David, the completion of all the commandments. The words of Maimonides. In the future, the Messianic king will arise and renew the Davidic dynasty, restoring it to its initial sovereignty. He will build the temple and gather the dispersed of Israel. Then in his days, the observance of all the statutes will return to their previous state. We will offer sacrifices and observe the sabbatical and jubilee years according to all their particulars as described by the Torah. Anyone who does not believe in him or does not await his coming denies not only the statements of the other prophets, but those of the Torah and Moses, our teacher. This is a law that we have to believe in him and await his coming. Who do we believe in and what are we awaiting? Says Maimonides, we're believing in and awaiting Moshiach, who is the completion of the fulfillment of all the commandments, because only through Moshiach will we be able to complete all the commandments. Now we understand why Maimonides quotes this passage, even though it's a book of laws, because he's giving us the tools to believe in Moshiach. He's explaining to us what the legal definition of Moshiach, what is his legal definition? The completion of all the commandments. And now that we know what his legal definition is, now we know who he is, not who literally, but what his definition is. Now we can actually wait for him. And so, God willing, with the study of the laws of Mashiach and studying about Mashiach, that should bring about the coming of Mashiach, where all this will be really practical. May it be speedily in our days. Amen.